things. Once again, this is a bit of a personal story, but a lot of history in between and fascinating things along the way. And there are three things that tie this story together. One is the story of a Native American, a tribal leader by the name of Sequoia, a British nobleman, the Duke of Wellington, who had a lot to do with India, and myself, how I found strange connections as I went along. And they were intriguing to me, so I thought I'd share this story with you guys. So back in 1969, I was at Berkeley, recently arrived, and the International House on campus, which housed foreign students, and also the Office of the Foreign Student Management officials. They invited me, they invited a whole lot of us to go on a trip. And I went along, and this bus like this one went from Berkeley to this forest called Muir Woods, which is just north of San Francisco in California. And this is a forest of big trees, Muir Woods. It's a forest of the redwood trees, which is a subset of the Sequoia family. And I became quite fascinated with these trees because they are huge. They're enormous. They live forever. They survive fires. And they're just absolutely lovable. Look at the size of this tree. This is the largest tree in the United States and in the world. It has a name, the General Sherman tree. General Sherman was one of the generals of the American Civil War who burned through Georgia, state of Georgia, and was part of the victorious army of Lincoln. This tree stands in one of our national parks here. It's enormous. To get an idea of the scale of these trees, I did this. I found another one. And you can see this person standing in the middle. If his or her height is h, then the diameter of this tree is 5.2 h. Okay, if this is Mukundacharya size, then the width is 26 feet. That's a huge diameter. The room in which I sit and spend most of my time, my study, is 12 feet wide. It's quite wide. So this is 2.5 times the width of my room. It is something that we have really a hard time grasping. You go to these forests and you see these trees and you are awestruck. And you come home and you just cannot reconstruct in your mind's eye the enormous size of these trees and how long they live. Among the characteristics are the fluted bark. Now, this is a cluster of these. And you see how the barks are fluted? They are long with gaps in between. They're like furrows in a field, in a farm. And that's typical. And this bark can be a foot or more thick. The furrows can be 50 feet long. The trees can be 300 feet plus tall. And they don't have to be particularly far apart. These trees, as you can see, are barely 15, 20 feet apart, maybe 25 feet. And they can draw enough nutrition from the soil that this array of what appears to be Greek columns is standing in a forest, presumably for 1,000 or 2,000 years. They are just awesome and awe-inspiring. And I have stood in a forest of these trees many times and been completely awestruck and overwhelmed. The oldest of these trees is a tree that's about 3,200 years old. And think about that, 3,200 years old. So when Rome was coming to be, the tree was already 1,000 years old. It was already 1,000 years old when Rome began. It was, my wife just walked in, distracting me. The tree, this tree is older than the founding of the Maurya Empire of India. It's older than the great Buddha. But the pyramids are even older. So they're not the oldest thing, except they are the oldest things alive. And they are just awe-inspiring. So I found a table of the biggest sequoias in the US. By the way, they only grew in California when you look around the world, and they have propagated out of California. So here's a table of the largest sequoias in the US, in California now. On the top line is a tree in Kings Canyon National Park. It has a girth, perimeter, a perimeter of 27.8 meters. That means a diameter of 29 feet. 29 feet. If you would please imagine how wide the room is where you're sitting, and double that or triple that, whatever it takes, that would be the diameter of the widest tree in California. The tallest, this is of course not the tallest, only about a little under 300 feet. The tallest one is Oric, Redwood National Park, California. It's 106 meters tall. 106 meters, 348 feet. Think about that. 348 feet is longer than the World Cup soccer field. Longer than the soccer field. So if this tree were to fall on a soccer field, it would go from one goalpost to the next goalpost and still leave a number of feet in addition. It is just staggering. It's hard to understand how these things grow so big. And they just draw you in, and the admiration that you feel for the wonders of nature. So these were discovered first by Spaniards, with explorers on the west coast of what was the unknown new land, the Americas.
European.
What?
You should say European.
Okay, my corrector is sitting next to me. So among the Europeans, the Spaniards were fine. Of course, there had been natives living on the land here. And that sparked quite a frenzy. So I'm going to tell you about that. Sorry for all this text here. I will simply read it to you. Don't bother reading yourself. The Spanish padres of Portola's expedition probably first saw the redwoods in 1769 during exploration and colonization along the coast of California. So for those of you who live in India and have not traveled to the United States, this is the far northwest, far west of the American continent. So the Spaniards called the trees Palo Colorado. Palo Colorado meaning red trees, or redwood, because of the bright red color of the heartwood. The discovery that the redwood was a new botanical species was made in 1794 by Archibald Menzies, a botanist with the Vancouver expedition. In 1823, a fellow by name A.B. Lambert, an English botanist, first gave it a scientific name, Sempervirens. Sempervirens is Latin for long living, long vital.
Oh,
And Latin is like Sanskrit for the Europeans. So it was kind of a special word, that's a name. And it was thought to be in the same genus as the bald cypress, another tree that is a conifer tree, all straight growing in the high latitudes. Sorry. Now then, Stephen Endlicher, a German botanist, decided that specimens he had studied represented an entirely new genus that is not connected to any of the earlier known species of the Europeans. And so in 1847, he named it Sequoia, but retained the species name of sempervirens. That is how the name became Sequoia sempervirens. Now, among those of you among us who know this tree will say that you'll be saying something wrong. The trees of Muir Woods are not giant sequoia, they're sempervirens, and we'll talk about that. The more massive variety of these trees in the mountains got the name Sequoia giganteum because they were big trees. They were bigger in diameter, just a little bit shorter than the coastal variety, which got the name sempervirens. So who the heck was Sequoia and why did they settle on this name? On the left in this picture is a statue that stands in the US Capitol, in the rotunda. It's of an Indian chief. He was a Cherokee Indian. His mother was Cherokee. His father seems to have been a European man. He never learned to speak, read, or write English. He was an accomplished silversmith, however, a painter, and a warrior. And he had served with the US Army in the Creek War of 1813 and 15. Don't ask me what that war was. The name was spelled originally with a Y-A-H, Sequoia. He was convinced that the secret of what he considered the white people's superior power was written language. And that enabled them to accumulate and transmit knowledge than was possible for a people dependent on memory or mouth. When I read that, I thought how true it also applies to us, to our history. Although we had a written language, it was not accessible to the vast majority of people. And so the culture of memory for passing information existed. And that has produced unreliable information, spotty information, and so on. So Mr. Sequoia invented a 72-character alphabet. Now, before you go away from this talk, consider having to invent an alphabet. I have no idea who invented the Latin alphabet, the Hindi alphabet, the Kannada alphabet, or whatever. For one man to take their language and divide it into 72 characters that can be synthesized to express anything that is spoken, it's a phenomenal deal. And that was the recognition that he was given. And this German fellow who identified the sequoia trees as a new genus was the one to choose the name sequoia. And so you have to admire also the existence of scientific societies in Europe in those times, that they had the discipline of people who named trees. I don't know how trees get named if a new species is identified in India. I sure would be interested to know. Now, the tree was discovered by British, and this is a short history of how that worked. A British Englishman, an Englishman, William Lobb, heard of monster trees in 1852. And he visited the forest in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California to see them. A year later, a fellow by name Lobb rushed to the foothills of this mountain range, found 90 giant trees. And he found one that had been felled, was large enough to seat a piano and an assembly of 30. It's a gigantic stump of a tree. Lobb rushed back to England with seeds. So mark the year 1853. The first seeds of sequoia trees reach England, 1853. The arrival of these seeds sparked a craze in the UK. Sequoias became a status symbol. Of course, it's a status conscious society. If you got the tallest trees, you are the biggest hero. Sequoias in Britain, and therefore it followed that they would go from England to Scotland and onward to other colonies, wherever the British people had gone. They are no older than 1853. That's a great marker of time. Okay, the sequoia I have shown here on the left is at the Scotney Castle in the United Kingdom. And it looks to my eye to be not among the most beautiful, but it is among the first. By the way, I have on all these pages the links to all the sources of all this information. Now, in Scotland, somebody else planted this double row of trees, and they call it the Avenue of the Giants. Obviously, these were also planted sometime after 1853. And you don't get a sense of how tall these trees are until you see the humans standing in the middle, in the bottom of the picture. And this is in the Benmore Botanic Garden of Scotland. There are no other known avenues of the giants to me. Okay, if Scotland, why not New Zealand? Here we have trees in New Zealand, also planted no sooner than 1853. And the one in the middle of this scene here is a shorty. It's only 57 meters tall. Convert that to feet, that's about 180 feet. It's no slouch. It's a giant, and it's only about 150 years old. Now, it turns out that I have a scientific colleague in Christchurch in New Zealand, and I talk about sequoias all the time with my colleagues. And I mentioned to him, and I asked if he knew of any sequoias in New Zealand. This is before I learned about this one. And he said, "Oh yeah, there's a plantation right next to where I work in Christchurch, and I go jogging there every day." So they are quite widespread in the European world. I have not found any in India, and I've looked on the web quite a bit, not found any. Now, here's some sequoias from my own gallery of sequoias. The first one on the left is a 61-foot tall tree as measured last year. It's the California post-redwood type, the first ones that I saw. It's at Cambridge University in England, where I have a friend. I had given it to him, a geologist. He planted it, and he's a faculty member, retired now. Every year, he sends me a photograph of the updates, and it's a pleasure. On India's 50th Independence Day, we planted 5 trees, one for each 10 years. And these are they now, picture taken last year. And for scale, here's my wife and the dog on the leash. and a bench that we had put by the tree with a plaque. The plaque says a gift of the Indian American community. The third picture on the scene is a tree planted in memory of my father in the year 2001. It is now also about 50 feet tall. And then last of all is a 1,000-tree plantation that we are about to do in our city. So, and there are a lot many more that I have planted and grown and given away and so on. So this is not just a casual thing, it's a passion. Okay, now the Brits, of course, always want to have it their way. There was a huge row in naming of the tree. The Americans said, this is our tree and we want to name it Washingtonia. The British wanted to name it after their hero, the Duke of Wellington. They want to name it Wellingtonia. Now, see, Washington got this monument in Washington, D.C., which many of you would have seen. It's 555 feet tall. It was finished on 21st February 1885. It's a four-sided obelisk, and it was finished in 2 stages. And if you look carefully, there's a break in the color here because the Civil War, the American Civil War, led to an interruption in construction. Anyway, this is a monument that everybody goes and sees in Washington, D.C. Correspondingly, in Britain, there is a monument to the Duke of Wellington. It's not quite as tall, it's only about a third as tall, 175 feet. It was inaugurated on 18th June 1822. And unlike the Washington Monument, this is a three-sided obelisk. So it's considerably shorter, but so is, of course, the landmass. Now, the Americans wanted their tree named Washingtonia. The Brits wanted to name their trees Wellingtonia. So there was a transatlantic fight going on. Along come botanists and they say, folks, Washingtonia, the name, is already taken. It's taken by this palm tree that grows in California. And as it turns out, the Wellington name is taken by the Wellington Arnottiana garden bush. So the names are taken. You can't name the tree after either of these gentlemen. And so the name reverted to the Sequoia name given by that Antlisherha. So that information stayed with me for many, many years. And the question sort of remained nagging in my head. Why the fight for the name Wellington in UK? Who was this guy and why is he so important to the British? And about the time that Suresh Pawar asked if I would like to do another seminar, I happened to be looking at this and I found a well of information that ultimately relates to me, which became the fascination. So you have now seen the Native American whose name was Sequoia, and now you're about to learn of Wellington. Wellington is a huge British hero in modern times as well. He was twice the Prime Minister of Britain. He defeated the army of Napoleon. So Napoleon was defeated by an army consisting of 7 armies, and they were commanded by Wellington. So he gets the credit for defeating Napoleon, although it was really a group of 7 armies. When I was traipsing around Portugal with Eva in a region around Sintra, we heard the name Wellington again. And there was a faint bell that rang in my head about that name. That was about 20 years ago, maybe 25. And so this name has sort of been striking my head off and on. Who was this guy? And then I learned that he had several campaigns in India, defeating Tipu Sultan and causing the end of the Maratha Empire. All right, we're getting more interesting, more and more interested now. So these are the wars he fought in India. Battle of Malbani, Siege of Seringapatam, Sultanpur Topi, Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, and so on and so forth. And then at the bottom is this, there's a little bar on my screen. I hope you don't see that, showing the zoom options. But okay, maybe you can see my cursor. The Battle of Asai. So there are these 4 battles with the Kingdom of Maharashtra. Siege of Ahmednagar, which was apparently a very short fight. And the Duke of Wellington claims to have used just 2 step ladders to climb over the walls of the fort. They would use this fort, the British would, to lock up Gandhi and Nehru at one time. The second in this list is the Battle of Asai. And the Battle of Asai has a very special place in the history of the British and of Marathas. And there is the Battle of Aragon and Siege of so on and so forth. So the Battle of Asai took on special importance for me because that is the one that the Duke of Wellington claimed was the toughest battle he ever fought, toughest of his life. It was not Waterloo. Waterloo, where he defeated his armies, defeated Napoleon, was not the toughest battle. It was a battle in a village of Asai, which is in Maharashtra, where he damn near lost his life and lost control, but regained it. This was the Second Maratha War, and it ended the Maratha Empire. So that becomes significant. So now it's time to see, okay, what the heck was so significant about this war, and why did he win it? So the Duke of Wellington, who had not yet been called the Duke of Wellington, he was still, what the hell was his name? Well, anyway, I'll just keep calling him Duke of Wellington. So this war was fought in near the village of Asai, which is here in this map. This is a map made from memory by the warriors of the time. And here's how it went. The Maratha army was poised here. There are 2 rivers going by. The village of Asai is here, and it's across from a ford in the river. A ford is a shallow part of the river. So the Maratha army is poised here. Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, is poised here. Well, there's a little detail. So the Maratha army initially was here. Wellesley had come in from North Kola. Well, and that's my connection. And he had scouted and determined that the Maratha army was by this river here. And he went around looking for another ford in this river here where they could cross. So the day of the battle, he had his army of about 6,000 men cross this ford. And he found this ford because, by the way, there were 2 villages of Pipalgaon and Warur. across the water. So he decided there must be a ford in the river, which is why the two villages were across from each other. So he took his army, crossed the river here, and poised himself and his troops. His troops consisted of the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery. They had artillery, top. And he prepared to fight here. Now the Marathas had to move their forces around to come face to face with Wellesley. Now, the Marathas had about 20,000 men or 10,000 men, and they were commanded by a German man, Holman. I did not find any information on why a German man would be commanding an army of 20,000 Marathas, and why an Englishman would be commanding an army of Marathas on the other side, and his own men. And this is now 23rd September 1803. They go head to head. The Marathas have a hard time turning around. They waste time here. Wellesley has been very smart. He launched the attack before breakfast. His soldiers had not eaten yet, but he had the advantage of time. It was a brutal fight, and Wellesley's forces won the battle. Remember, this is one of many wars that he fought with the Maratha Empire. So where did this occur? Here on the screen is Nagpur. There's Akola, that ugly little city where I grew up. And there's a village, Vasai, just a little west of Akola. So let's see more about this. In modern times, I'm able to find Vasai and look at the hand memory sketch made by hand back then, and the reality from Google Earth. Here are the two rivers. Here are the two villages, Warur and Peoplegaon. Here's the village Asai. And the Battle of Asai occurred here. So this place is 77 miles from Akola, a little south of due west. Now, it turns out that the remnants of battle, bullet casings and such, can still be found in the village of Asai here. So I became curious about this little village of Asai. And of course, Google Earth lets you see what the village was like from the sky. It's a tiny little village, but in the consciousness of British historians and British peoples, it is a significant place because Wellington made it famous. And here's a bridge in modern times across one of the rivers. There is a place named here, which I cannot read, but there's Mahadev Temple and so on. So the place continues to be, and this is a picture taken by a satellite on Christmas Eve of last year, 2022. And thanks to Google Earth, you can get a street view of the village of Asai today. And it's just like any other Indian village, nothing extraordinary. Now, it turns out that Indian portrayals of the war, sketches or artwork, are not visible on the internet. If they exist, we probably have to wait a while before they show up. So all the art depicting this war is of British origins. And here you see the great Arthur Wesley, the future Duke of Wellington, on a horse. There are the soldiers of the East India Company. There is the battle being displayed from the British perspective. The redcoats are the Brits. A Maratha warrior is shown on horseback, and that's a fairly respectful portrayal. And then there is this sketch also available. So if you're interested, you can find all this stuff on by clicking on this link here. You can find all this stuff. In fact, you can even find a train station in India that's called Wellington. Now, if we have Allahabad, Aurangabad, Ahmednagar, Mughal names added by the victors, the British added their own names, Wellington. But Wellington must have been done after he had gone back, because he was made into a duke after his return from these wars. So this train station was named long after Arthur Wellesley left Great Britain, left India, sorry. This place, Wellington, the train station, is in a corner of Tamil Nadu.
Wow.
Small little place, no great consequence. No, the battle was not here. The battle was way. Yeah. And there's also this defense college named after Wellington in Madras, I think. Now, I had shared this presentation with Sir K.K. Chopra, and K.K. sent me a picture of himself standing in front of a modern version of this cantonment. Apparently, it's been destroyed and rebuilt in an Indian design that does not pay any homage to the British. I had intended to show you that, but maybe I can find that later. If you're interested in taking a tour, you can go on a cultural experience. Of course, it is part of the proud heritage of the British. So the British go on these tours, and you can take a tour of Wellington in India. The master learns his trade. And these are narrated tours. And I find them to be quite interesting, very academic sounding scholars who have studied the career of Arthur Wellesley. They describe the wars in great detail and how the Battle of Versailles ended the Maratha Empire, where the losing army's men ran after the battle was called off. And they hid in a small fort of Gavalgarh. I don't know how to pronounce it. I only know how it's written in English. Gavalgarh. And they were finally caught up. They were defeated there and killed off. So you can take a tour, and the tour goes to a site where local residents have one or two persons who can remember the story of this battle. Remember, the story is on 1803. So it's been a long time, 220 years. So that memory is more or less lost. There are no memorials to that. The victors make memorials, the vanquished don't. Our side did not. Now, the connection to this became personal to me when I realized that before this battle, Wellington had gone through Akola and taken his army with him. And he had camped in this little fort in Akola. This is an ugly little fort. Well, maybe not so ugly. Little fort across a dirty river, which I crossed many, many times as a child. And this is the closest I have come to something significant in history in my life. To me, it appeared things always happened elsewhere. And if you take a tour with that tour company that I just talked to you about, they go through this town, they take a stop in the hotel where we have been staying. And so that was a kind of connection. So you got the three things: the native, that was Sequoia; the Englishman, the noble, that's the Duke of Wellington. You got that title back in Britain after all these wars. And yours truly, the little Indian. So that is the story, a chance visit to Muir Woods ignited my passion for these trees. The name Sequoia begged explanation, and that search took me to the row between the American and British botanists on the naming of the tree. And the name row then took me to the history of the Duke of Wellington. And it ended my sense that nothing historical ever happened in places where I have lived. That's the story. Open to questions.
You have to open.
What do I have to do? Okay. Is everybody asleep?
You have to stop
No,
sharing,
no.
Yogi.
We are all awake.
Tremendous story.
Yeah, thank you.
And Yogi, your story was so captivating that there are hardly any comments in the chat box, except for one or two.
Can I hear?
It's a wonderful story. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, away from all the technical bullshit that we keep talking.
I know. And there's so much history that we don't know about our own history.
Quite true, quite true.
The only history that you know right now is what was taught to us. And it really
Yes.
started with the Mughals. Where you go, at least where I grew up, you'll see remnants of forts and buildings of ancient times totally not kept up. And just rumors about it. I remember in Delhi, at least, there was called the Old Fort. What was the Old Fort about? Nobody knew, but it dated back to the early part of the history of one of the about 100 or 200 AD, and never had a history of what it was. And I think this shows us, as the history is written by the victors, there are a whole bunch of things in our history that we don't know and don't have it.
Yes, and as I said, if I may jump in, you know, the chief Sequoia, his observation that you cannot communicate detailed history without the written word. That's so absolutely true, because the history of India, these little battles and details did not get recorded in a way that was accessible to us students.
Yeah.
And so we are basically ignorant. And we claim routinely, habitually, that we have a great history. We don't know it.
Absolutely.
That is true, Yogi, I think. But even where things were written, we still don't have our own, some of the languages which were old or in which things were written. We still haven't found the Rosetta Stone to make a translation of it, you know.
Yeah.
There's that. So
I think though it is we don't have the confidence right now to learn about ourselves. That I think we have been so much, you know, under the sway of both the British and before that the Mughals, that are old. For example, the recent movie that has just come out, you know, the Ponniyin Selvan 2, which is a movie, but it's based on historical context of the Chola Empire. The Chola Empire lasted in Tamil Nadu for 1300 years, you know, from before the BC to about 1000 AD. And it went all the way to the Far East, you know, to Indonesia and Malaysia and all of that. So, but we don't know. In the North, nobody knew. I mean, I grew up in the North. I was born in Nagpur. And so I know about the Mughals, but I did not know much about the South Indian history and stuff like that. So we need to basically relearn our own past in some ways to bring it to the future, basically. So it's a matter of confidence, I think. Once we become more self-confident, we will do more of that.
yeah, you know, let me pick up a little bit on that. So in my perspective, there are a number of factors. There are always many factors that affect it, right? First of all, the written script was not broadly known whether in Europe or in India.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay. But the church, the Christian religion in Europe made it accessible and encouraged it actively. Whereas I'm not aware of any Hindu temple attempt or any other institutional attempt to educate the public in reading and writing. We had the caste system, which basically said 3/4 of the population doesn't need to know. And we didn't have a school system to educate the children. We had the guru and the shishya. And then comes along the printing press, which suddenly makes the written word available to everybody in Europe. But it's much later that it comes to India.
Mhm.
And even then, the complexity of the caste system that devalues this huge part of the that does not let the written word become available or legible to a vast part of the population. So these factors of history kept the Indian people basically ill-informed, as Chief Sequoia was saying. The Europeans had the written word, they could carry and transfer a lot more information, which the natives could not at that time, which is why he invented language. We still have about 20 or 30% of the population that cannot read.
Yeah.
So that's a tremendous difference. And of course, when you have that situation, people don't have facts. They believe anything they hear, and rumors, propagate and so on. Yeah.
I think you had it. It was just more broadcast in Europe. So, for example, the conquering of the Inca Empire, the Spaniards already sort of knew what to expect because of writings from previous explorers who had come.
Something different.
Well, no, I'm saying the language writing was broadcast in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
And less so in India, but you had, I'm sure, documents stuff just was not.
Yeah.
Yogi, I have two questions. The name of your company was also inspired from here?
Yes, the company was formed long after this passion of mine had been ignited. And so the company's name Sequoias Scientific. I should point out that there is a certain important tree that a certain person attending this meeting has not mentioned. It grows in California. Mukund, you want to tell them about that?
So I had my hand up for three reasons. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me talk about the third one first. The one special tree that Yogi and Eva helped me plant, what about almost 8 years ago now. She's a Sequoia giganteum, and she sits right behind the bench in a park about 3 minutes walk from me, in memory of my wife. When we planted it, it was a sapling that came in a little cardboard tube, and the park manager looked at it and said, "It's too frail to be parked right now. You put in a little pot in your backyard, let it settle for about 6 months, and we'll plant it in spring," which is what I did. So when we planted it, it was the size in the pot. The trunk was the size of a pencil, and she was like little under 2 feet tall. And now she sits in the park and is probably about 9 or 10 feet. And I wrote somewhere that if you come back in a couple of 100 years, you'll see how tall she's going to be.
So I have, sorry, go ahead, Mukund.
Yeah, go ahead.
I brought 2 specimens for you guys to see.
Oh,
I usually have a dozen or two on my deck. And this one is growing in an empty cut-off tonic water bottle. And this one is proper. So the seed that they grow from is the size of a grain of wheat. If you stomp on a grain of wheat, that's the seed of the sequoia. And it's kind of impressive to think about how much information about the growth of that tree is encoded into the DNA of this little seed. Blows your mind.
Yeah. I take a picture of that tree, periodically, and if I find one in my phone, I'll send it to add to a collection of Yogi's sequoia pictures. I'll send you a picture of Sandhya's tree just for interest. But I did have a couple other comments. KK, is it okay if I go now?
Yeah, please.
So I guess the first one was, we talked about the written language, but historically in India and elsewhere, history was transmitted in the form of stories from person to person to person. And it was our ability to remember the stories and pass them on from generation to generation before they were written down. That has preserved much of that for us, and in some cases not preserved, right? Even the Vedas were apparently written that way. So I guess I'd be interested in hearing in this context, the comment on this group as to how you would reconcile, I guess, the presence or absence of historical knowledge with that loss of transmission from time to time. So I'll just put that aside. And the one other comment I wanted to make, Yogi, is when you showed the sign of the picture of Wellington, you were still talking about the village Battle of Asai at that point, and you brought that up. And the first thing that struck me was, why is the name of Wellington on top in Tamil? That there's that much Tamil I can still read. And then a couple of slides later, you said, that's somewhere in Tamil Nadu. So that is a personal take. But what I wanted to say was, at least in India, we had a lot of, I guess, British history in the names of streets and buildings and so on in various towns and cities. And in India, to a large extent, we've gone about erasing that for whatever, I mean, that we won't talk about the pros and cons of doing that, by replacing those names with Indian names, right? And so with that kind of approach that we've taken over generations, I think we lose some historical context of that local region.
Yeah,
Or
Just want to say.
Well,
Sure.
I disagree with that, but let's not go there. Yeah.
Say it again?
I said I disagree with that strongly. I mean, if you wanted to build the statues of Hitler to say we should not lose history, would that be the right thing to do? No, you don't.
Suresh, I think the point is slightly different. The point is that the victors write history,
right?
but then some victors rewrite history. I think it's the rewriting of history which is being talked about.
The written part sometimes also based on context and your own mindset in terms of your own conclusions. And a lot of times objective history cannot really be written. You'll have to read many interpretations of various writers of the same event to give you a good understanding objectively if you choose to. Unfortunately, a lot of times our objectivity is also kind of a translucent way, because we do tend to believe what we want to believe and not believe what we don't want to believe because it doesn't agree with our thought process or our own mindset about the conclusions that have been given to us.
So
So-
Suresh, I just want to respond to what you said.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not a question of agreement or disagreement with the stance of what happened in history.
Mhm.
I'm saying that we tend to try and erase history in certain ways. I'm not talking about right or wrong here.
Yeah.
And it's often a valuable, we have to learn the lessons of history, otherwise we're going to be prone to repeat it. And so by deliberately trying to erase historical context, we sometimes do a disservice to ourselves.
Okay,
That's what I was trying to
I
say.
agree with
I
that.
change the
completely.
topic slightly. Yogi, on your thing on Sequoia, did you find out more about him? What exactly he did after writing the alphabet, the Cherokee alphabet?
No,
His other contributions?
there's not much written about him. After all, he was an incidental name chosen by the botanist, not
That
for,
was chosen because of something he did. So it must have been more than just, I mean, I'm sure the alphabet was a big thing, but anything more about him that he did?
I have not, I will look some more. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just curious. Sorry, I didn't mean to digress from the
Let
other
me-
discussion.
I had my hand risen, but I haven't been called yet, so let me interject. Uh,
No,
What I want to say is that I've been reading a book recently about Finnish immigration to the US, right around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, right around that time. And they came to southern part of Washington-Oregon border, around Deep River. I don't know if you're familiar with that, Yogi. And they were primarily loggers, and they logged the trees. And the history described it that the 12 to 20 feet were very typical tree sizes in terms of diameter. And they were not sequoia, they were Douglas fir, and there were some other varieties I don't remember, but Douglas fir about 20 feet, and they went up to hundreds of feet. And I think they've all been kind of just wiped out. The forests have been wiped out for that. That's true. In fact, if you come here next time, there's a place called the Grove of Patriarchs. It's a small little area, about an acre or so, or a few acres, where there are big Douglas fir trees. They're about 15-foot diameter. So they are approaching the scale of the sequoia, but not quite there. And you can walk around them. And the reason these survive and not others is because this piece of land is surrounded by a stream. So fires have escaped. So these trees have escaped fires. I think you noticed, perhaps in one of the slides I showed, the sequoias almost always have a hollow at the base, and that's burnt out portion of the trunk of the tree. If you live 2,000 years, no doubt you see fires. And so the fires burn a little bit of the base. The bark of the sequoia has this curious property that it resists fires. And so the sequoia survives fires, which is not true of any other tree that I know.
Interesting.
To add to what you're saying, Suresh, speaking of the Fens, and they did settle here in Washington, near us, in fact. We just planted a tree, a sequoia, at Lewis Creek Park. It's my mom's sequoia. And what is interesting is that the city of Bellevue, instead of planting Douglas firs to increase our canopy in the area, they're planting sequoias. Why? Because of what Yogi just said. They're more resistant to fires and drought, and that as climate is changing, they're realizing that we have to change the species that we're planting in this area. So that's why we're involved in this 1,000 sequoia planting.
I have to say that this is the largest planting that we are doing,
Right.
we would ever have done. And now I have about maybe 10 years of life left, maybe. They will not have reached anything like the majesty of it, even the ones I planted 30 years ago. But it is the grandest project of tree planting that we initiated. And we were seated at Eva's mom's memorial tree planting a few months ago. And it was Eva's idea that the planting of the 1,000 should be named Grove of Matriarchs. There are lots of groves of patriarchs,
Okay.
none of matriarchs. So this will be the first one, Grove of Matriarchs.
Let me finish. So where my mom is in a former 5-acre farm owned by a Finnish family. And that's what I wanted to dovetail on to what Sudesh was saying. So the Finns are very much a part of the Sequoias.
Okay,
KK,
KK, you
KK,
got
you
your
have a-
hand up.
Yeah. So, Yogi, in the initial 1 or 2 slides, you showed a tree whose name was General Sherman tree. Now, is it the same general with whom the Sherman tanks are associated?
Yes.
Yep.
General Sherman is a huge personality in American history. The Northern Americans who won the Civil War treat him as a kind of a god, but they don't make gods out of men in this country. There is no Mahatma style deification, but that was General Sherman. I forgot to say something very important about Duke of Wellington. One of the reasons he constantly won his wars was because he maintained a tremendous supply line. And he, in fact, maintained a nursery for horses, whatever that's called, so that there was a constant supply of young horses to carry supplies to the battlefield. And that was a major reason why he would win wars. The others didn't have supply lines. And as it turns out, we have a neighbor who is a retired general. He's living, he fought in the Korean War. And he has just given me a book to read. He asserts that the Germans during the World War never put enough value on supply lines. So the part of the army that takes care of that, logistics, was always devalued by the Germans, and that is why they lost all the wars. In any case, Wellington understood the importance of supply lines, and that was a large part of why he won many wars.
Okay. Yogi Mukund has some comments and I read out. First one is that some sequoias have a bare trunk part of the way up before the branches begin, whereas others have very low branches. Are these different subspecies of sequoia?
I didn't fully hear you. Let me put my ears on.
Okay.
Or you can read the comment.
Oh,
Or you can read it in the chat also.
okay. Let me do that. Oh, there are lots of chat.
There are lots.
This is the
Okay,
first comment.
first comment. Some sequoia have a bare trunk part of the way up before the branches begin. Oh, the tree has a habit of dropping the lowest branches
As it grows.
as growth.
Okay.
So the in the grove that you showed us, Yogi, all the trees have branches all the way down. Those are going to be dropped as the tree grows older.
That's right. Many of them don't have any branches till about 100 feet up from the ground.
So it's a sign of being a toddler then.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, and Mukund had a question about any markings of the Battle of Versailles. No, it turns out no. Isn't that a shame? Of course, it's a shame because this is where the Maratha Empire came to an end. And I have a slide to show you how extensive the empire was. Let me see. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, you can share your screen, but I think we need to wind up because people are signing off. Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here, this one, okay. You see, these are two maps. Let me build it up. One, they're 1795, and this is 1797, so about the same time, both of them. and look at the extent of the Maratha Empire as depicted in this older looking map, and this one depicted by Encyclopedia Britannica. So the Maratha Empire was much larger than it is today. It pretty much included Madhya Pradesh, good chunk of modern Gujarat, and it kind of surrounded the Nizam's dominions. It was huge. And that was what was lost at the Battle of Versailles. There are other questions.